La coordinación de la licenciatura les da la más cálida bienvenida a las actividades de la primera semana de las Ciencias de la Educación en su 20 aniversario. Esperamos sea de su agrado y las disfruten. Bienvenidos.
Hola, buenos días a todos y gracias por acompañarnos en la primera semana de las Ciencias de la Educación. Contamos hoy con la presencia del profesor Harry Daniels, doctor y profesor de tiempo completo de la Universidad de Oxford. So, Dr. Daniels is Professor of Education at Oxford University, Director of the Center for Sociocultural and Activity Theory Research, and Professor of Education in UK. Dr. Daniels is also acting professor at Centre for Learning Research, Griffith University, Brisbane, Australia. Research professor at Centre for Human Activity Theory at Kansai University, Osaka, Japan. Research professor in Cultural Historical Psychology at Moscow State University of Psychology and Education. Dr. Daniels' research includes work on process of social exclusion and process of collaboration. Dr. Daniels has directed more than 40 research projects funded by ESRC, various central and local government sources. He has collaborated in various books, and he is director of more than 40 investigations. And today, he is accompanying us. Please be welcome to the spaces of the Autonomous University of Hidalgo, and particularly to the career of Education Science, Professor Dr. Harry Daniels.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
The topic is inclusion, exclusion, and scholar design. So to begin with it seems correct when to take into account and ask you, what is inclusion? Which means inclusion really? Because we all the time try to or have in mind the idea that inclusion refers to integrating everyone equally into school spaces. But there are people with different capacities and needs, so to ask, when can we say that we are inclusive?
Right. Well, if we take a historical look at this, in the 1980s particularly, people used to talk about integration. That was fitting people into an existing system. In other words, the system didn't change, we just brought people into it. Then around the late, well, certainly by the 1990s, people started to talk more about inclusion, which was about developing the system to be more inclusive. So the emphasis was on making schooling, for instance, more open to a wider range of people, whereas integration was about making the person fit in. Inclusion is about making the system welcoming to everyone, not just welcoming, but also with systems of instruction that everyone can learn from. So that's the big difference there, that it's on, the emphasis is on the development of the system.
The system, the government try to include people, but I think that there are no prepared. To all our participants, you can open your microphone to explain or ask something, or in the chat. Remember, the topics are inclusion, exclusion, and scholar design. So you can up your hand to ask something.
A question, Eric, or Doctor. How school design reflects that inclusion or exclusion are part of its philosophy?
can I just repeat that? You want to know
Yes.
about how school design makes an impact on exclusion and inclusion?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. That's a very important and really rather difficult question. If we look at traditional school design, and which I suspect large numbers of schools in Mexico are quite traditional, with a teacher at the front and rows of children looking at the teacher. It's very difficult to individualize instruction in that setting. And there have been a lot of attempts in Central and South America to develop designs which are more inclusive. The problem is that when you look at the advice for, say, children with hearing impairments, and then you compare them with children with visual impairments, actually the design issues fight against each other. So developing an inclusive design is really very, very difficult. And I don't really think a lot of progress has been made. So many educational systems are based on the idea that one size fits all. In other words, you can have one educational diet for all children. And even organizations like OECD, the International Economic Organization, they had a very, very big research project. And the question was, which school design most increases attainment, which assumes that one design will work in the same way anywhere. The results of our own work see design as a social practice, which depends on good collaboration, not only between the architects and the engineers and the teachers, but also with the community in which the school is going to be based. So having good consultation between the community and between the school designers and builders comes across as absolutely vital. The other set of principles are around learning. I mean, just imagine if you were a school teacher in a school that had the typical 30 children just sitting in a room with one teacher. Then you've got a job in a school which had very large open areas with maybe 5 or 6 children and maybe close to 200 youngsters in there. It's a very different job. And people have to learn how to work in different situations. And there we have the notion of the building as a tool. And as with any new tool, for example, a computer or whatever else, you have to learn to use it. And too much of the time, there's not enough energy put into learning how to use buildings once they've been designed. So I would say there's 2 very important things if you're going to try and maximize inclusion in a school design. One of them is collaboration and communication, and the other is learning.
Okay. I mean, we think, I've said before, we think that we are inclusive when we openly say to the people, yeah, you can come to us, but we are really prepared. I mean, this all time is happening, and the information and the capacity and even the education process is being affected with all the disinformation that exists. Anyone can ask something? Siéntanse con la confianza, de verdad.
Shall I say something about the project we're doing at the moment on exclusion?
Yeah.
Yeah. When I first came to Oxford, I started to bring together a group of academics from across the disciplines, because so much work on exclusion is done by just educationalists. So we now have a group of people who include psychiatrists, criminologists, lawyers, people interested in how children use the internet. Oh, sorry. A friend of mine's calling from Spain. And a whole range of different disciplines. And that we call the project Excluded Lives. And the idea is there to try and get a whole impression of what happens to someone when they're excluded. The other thing that we're doing is comparing practices and outcomes across the countries of the United Kingdom. So England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And you might think, well, they're going to be pretty much the same. Well, actually, I don't know what it's like in the regions of Mexico, but across the UK, huge differences. So the last time the figures were produced for England, we had excluded permanently 8,000 children in 1 year from school. Now, if you look at the figures for Scotland, there were only 3 children who had been excluded. So although Scotland is smaller than England, even so, that difference is enormous. When you look at the policy documents, lots of the policy documents in England are very much about punishment. So if a child does something wrong, then the head teacher has the right to punish them by exclusion. Whereas in Scotland, they don't even mention behavior. They talk about relationships. And they talk about, this is the government policy documents. And they talk about inclusion, engagement, and participation. So there's a very different philosophical underpinning to policy in the two countries. And the figures for Northern Ireland and Wales are, they're certainly less than England, but they're not as low as Scotland. So we got together a group in the universities of Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast, together with us in Oxford, to start a comparative project. And we're looking at the policy frameworks. We're looking at the legal frameworks. We're using large databases of government-held data to examine the consequences of different social conditions for exclusion. We're looking at what happens after exclusion, particularly in terms of progress into the labor market, to the extent to which people who get excluded get a job or they end up in trouble with the police. And that's very important here at the moment, in that we have, and I know you have similar issues, we have a lot of organized crime based on the drug trade, and they recruit young people into this to carry drugs, to carry money, sometimes to carry weapons. And it's young people who are easily persuaded to do this kind of thing. And particularly kids who are excluded from school, certainly if they're not doing anything else, are very easy to recruit into that kind of work. We call it county lines, which has got, this is a rather stupid term for it. But there is a lot of concern about young people who get excluded, don't have anything else to do, and get picked up by organized crime. So we're looking at that as well. And then we're going to look at the experience of exclusion, both of educators, other professionals, the experience of parents and families when their child is excluded, and the experiences of young people themselves. And at the same time, we're going to go do a very detailed cost analysis, not just in terms of how much does a school place cost, but also things like if a child is sent home early from school and somebody, a mother or father, has to look after them, that would mean that they couldn't go to their job, and that would be a cost as well. So it's a 4-year project doing very, very detailed work of many, many aspects of the exclusion process. Understanding, particularly looking at how children get categorized in school and the differences in the processes of categorization in different schools. Because one of the things that comes out very, very quickly when you look at UK schools is the differences between them. So you can go from one school to another and you almost feel as though you're in a different conceptual universe because they look so different, they feel so different. And I think this is true across the world. Certainly when I worked in Russia, at the time those many schools were created, there was a belief that you didn't name a school, you just gave it a number because they were all the same thing. But when you go and look at them, they aren't, because the people who work in them create different cultures within those schools. And those cultures have huge implications for how many challenging young people can be maintained. So that's what we're doing. Hello.
Hello. Well, this is not really my research topic, but I'm interested in what you just mentioned about policy documents analysis. So can you say a little bit more about the analysis you are conducting regarding these documents? Because I have done policy analysis in the past to do something else, but I'm really interested in knowing about your methodology and so on, please.
We're developing it at the moment, actually. In activity theory, which is one of the theories I use, there's the notion of object. What is it that is being worked on? So the first thing we've been doing is looking through the policy documents and seeing what they announce as the issue to be worked on. And in England, the issue to be worked on is problematic behaviour. That's what the whole focus is. In Scotland, the issue to be worked on is building of community and building social cohesion. So right from the very start, you have a huge difference in the kinds of things that people are trying to do. Now, one of the problems is, particularly in a profession like schooling, is that people are very, very busy. They're very busy all of the time. And sometimes that, what you could call busy behavior, doesn't relate to what really they're trying to achieve. So if you when we speak to teachers sometimes, they'll talk about being exhausted and really overtired. And you look at what they do sometimes and you think, well, is that really necessary? And what is that doing? So for example, we worked in a city in the north of England, and they had a lot of money to develop an inclusive support service. And they were developing policies for that. And they told us they were running seminars, they had projects, they were going to schools and talking with people, and they were exhausted. They were really, really busy. And then we asked them, well, what is it that you're working on? What is it that you have to change if you're going to make the situation better? And no one had asked them that before. They were just caught up in doing lots of work. And eventually, and very uncomfortable, half an hour or so, somebody said, actually, it's professional identity that we need to be thinking about. Because so much of the time, professionals see themselves as isolated individuals, not collaborating with other people. if they started to see themselves as members of teams, particularly multi-professional teams, then the situation would be much better. And then we said, okay, right, if you're working on professional identity, can you point to some of the things that you've been doing that's going to work on professional identity? And they said, well, the man in charge of the project, you could see the blood drain out of his face because he realized they weren't. They were just doing stuff. They were just being busy rather than thinking analytically about the kinds of strategies that they needed to do. And you get that in policy documents as well. So the policy document will announce a particular object, and then what follows has nothing to do with it. It's a lot of political rhetoric. And they're internal, so we look at internal coherence and consistency in the documents themselves. We also look at the histories of them. So we trace the histories of policy development to see how they operate. And the other thing that we're really interested in is what could be called, so I doubt this will translate, recontextualization. How a policy, which is a national artifact, gets taken up in a particular setting, in a particular school. Now, I'll give you some examples of that. If you look at the law on exclusion, and our lawyer colleague has done this, and you speak to solicitors or barristers, legal officers, and you say, can you tell us about the law on exclusion? And they'll say, well, it's an interesting body of law because it rests on discretion. So you use the law with discretion to try and achieve the best possible outcomes for everyone involved. And then when you speak to an educationalist, they'll say, oh, it's a set of rules you've got to follow. So the same single thing, the law, has gone in completely different ways when it gets recontextualized in different settings. In the same way that behavior policies or anything else will get taken up. If you think of the school as a cultural site, the way that culture takes in stuff from the outside and transforms it is a particular interest. So we're not just interested as policy as text, but also policy as discourse, and how that discourse is transformed as it moves across particular cultural sites. Does that help?
Yeah. It was quite difficult for me to get into what you just mentioned, actually, looking at policy documents from these views as text and discourse. And actually, I at the end adopted a kind of critical discourse analysis. It was just a very, very small part of my study, but yeah, it's quite interesting.
We've looked at critical discourse analysis, and people like Norman Fairclough are very interesting. But when you try and answer the question, well, what does he actually do with a text? You know, how does he do this? Yeah, I can see the argument about unearthing the critical issues in this discourse, but I can't see how he does it anywhere. And I think that's a problem with critical discourse analysis generally. It's almost like somebody reading the newspaper critically and coming out with a view on it, which is fine, but it's not system. It doesn't feel to us. It doesn't feel systematic.
Yeah, I did my PhD at Lancaster, so
did you?
I read Fairclough, of course, and I ended up adopting his model, just part of it, because yeah, I do agree with you. It was quite difficult to follow, actually, to see like, how do I do it? Yeah.
Which department were you in at Lancaster?
Linguistics.
Right. Mm-hmm. Some very, very interesting people at Lancaster. Interesting people in the management department as well.
Yeah.
Do really good work. Yeah. No, it's a
Okay.
good job I didn't say anything rude then.
No, you didn't. Can I ask you another question? Are
Sure.
you also looking into literacy issues as part of this inclusion exclusion project?
Yes, in as much as literacy levels at the age of 11 are a very strong predictor of exclusion. Low literacy levels at age 11 are a very strong predictor of problems at the ages 14 to 16. I mean, we've got a growing problem here as well because we're such a, you know, the expression high stakes testing, because we've got such a vicious assessment system that teachers, if you don't have teachers working together, collaborating with each other, building strength in their culture, where they're able to say, well, this is what we think we should be doing. And they become highly individualized and always responsive to outside demands with no internal culture to support them. They can't cope. There's too much being asked of them. And what you get is that's the sort of recipe for higher levels of. So we've got 5-year-olds being excluded from school at the moment, which is just horrific. And we've got all sorts of problems growing. They're not large scale at the moment, but they're growing under the age of 11.
I had a chance to visit an elementary school or primary school in Blackpool. One of my lecturers was taking part of a big project, and she invited a few PhD students to come and visit this particular place because of these literacy issues they were having. And I was quite surprised, to be honest, because I thought, oh, this is not happening in the UK. It just happens in my country, in Mexico. And I could see, I had the chance to talk to some teachers that were actually working on a project to help parents be part of this project by they were promoting reading specifically. So they wanted to facilitate all the tools and in sources to parents so they could read their children at home because they are not doing it.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting place for you to have gone, Blackpool, because it has huge problems. It's got some very, very good people working there, but the problems are so enormous, whether it's illegal drug use, violence, poverty. It really is in a pretty bad state. And they've been trying really, really hard to reduce exclusion over the last 10 years. Not particularly helped by the government, it has to be said. But yeah, I mean, the situation is that one of the areas we're working with is very close to Blackpool. And we have, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've had a significant rise in knife crime among young people, and particularly in London, quite a lot of young people being killed in knife attacks. And the government, not through the education service, but for what we call the Home Office, which is internal affairs, they have promoted something called violence reduction units. And these are multi-agency, so it involves the police, social care, education, health. And what the people in that area, in the Blackpool area, are because we've spoken to them recently, are very interesting about. The leader said to us, what you have to understand is that we're building a social movement here. This isn't just a project intervention. We're building a social movement. And what we've done is to identify points of strength in each service. So they've got senior police officers senior health people, senior mental health people, senior educationists, who all agreed to a set of principles about how they work, which was particularly around the notion of restorative justice and what they call contextual safeguarding. Safeguarding is protecting children. Contextual safeguarding, you don't just say, oh, this child has hit 5 people in the last month. You say, what lies behind that? What is the context in which this is happening? Is there something that we can intervene in that context in order to stop these things happening in the first place? And people are referring to this kind of work as working upstream. So one person said, we ought to stop parking ambulances at the bottom of a cliff and start building fences at the top. Or stop pulling drowned children out of the pool and stop them falling into the stream in the first place. So it's another way of understanding early intervention. When you say early intervention in most educational settings in England, it's assumed you're talking about work with 4 and 5-year-olds. It's assumed this is early years is when early intervention happened. But our argument is that early intervention means that as soon as a problem manifests, you intervene and you try and understand it, and you try and understand the background to it as well. Just disappeared. Can you hear me?
Yes,
The
yes,
person
we
I
can
was just,
hear.
¿Sí? ¿Quería decir algo, maestra Hortensia?
I think Norma wants to speak.
Yeah. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and for inviting us.
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Okay, I'm going to get close my microphone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we know now with this whole globalization, we are trying to be according to many international standards and regarding education. So to what extent do you think the curriculum, the design is being affected by all these, regarding inclusion and exclusion, because we have to, we want to comply many standards, rankings, and sometimes as you were talking, the contexts are totally different between UK and Mexico. You have seen England regionally, but when we are talking internationally, I think we are facing lots of problems because all these international policies. So to what extent do you think we should or we shouldn't follow all these policies in order to have a good curriculum design that cover our national needs?
Yeah, the sound wasn't great, but I think I understood what you were saying. You're asking about the extent to which Mexico should follow international political directions. I think PISA has done a lot of damage because it directs attention just to a narrow set of attainments. It's interesting when you speak to employers and ask them what characteristics they'd like to see in the young people they'll employ, they'll say, oh, they've got to be good members of a team, they've got to be able to work flexibly and responsively in an agile way, and handle lots of information coming from different sources and make sense of it. And they'll come out with a whole stream of things like that, which you won't find in most curriculum formations at all. Yeah, curriculum formations still, and in England they've got worse, are still very much, you have to learn this, rather than, what kind of competencies or capabilities do you want to build in young people. The Finns are very interesting on this. I know the Finns do very well. Finland does very well on the PISA scores. But what they had there was a situation where they had a sort of national debate about whether they should go for high stakes testing, whether they should go for standardized assessments and standardized curriculum formations. And people by and large said, no, we need to think what it is that underlies all of this. And being a small, cold country on the northeast side of Europe, what is it that's going to help us as a country prosper and survive? And they came out with 3 capabilities. And that's creativity, imagination, and critical thinking. And they said we should base our curriculum on these 3 capabilities. So we ask ourselves, what is it that this activity will do in terms of promoting either creativity, imagination, and critical thinking, or all of them? And that's what's led to their very high levels of success. And if you go into an English classroom, as I'm sure Hilda will be able to say, and you say, what capabilities are you trying to promote in what you're doing? The teacher will look at you and say, what? That it's not part of the thinking. Whereas the Finns, through a massive consultation exercise, have retained that. Now, the government switched to being rather more right-wing about 5 years ago, but that has survived. That public understanding of the purposes of education, whereas the purpose of education in many people's minds is simply better schools, full stop. And when you look, particularly in England, we have league tables like the football. So this is school number 1 in this district, then 2, 3, 4, down to about 35. And the popular understanding is the difference between school 12 and school 13 is the same as the difference between school 1 and school 2. It's not. And you'll hear parents say, oh, my child's going to secondary school next year, and he was going to go to the school that's number 16 now, but I want to get him into school that's number 14 because it's a better school. Where the serious statisticians look at the data and they say, you can't do that. You can just about tell the very best schools and the very worst ones. Maybe 85 to 90% of the schools on those league tables are indistinguishable. There's no difference. So this idea of standardized testing fits a political story about competition and competition between schools. So way back in the 1980s here, we got the argument, competition brings quality. I would far rather see collaboration brings quality. So if I had any say in it, I would say Mexico would be best to think very carefully about the kind of capabilities that they want to promote through its education system that will build the kind of culture that Mexico wants to see, and then ask questions about what is the right kind of educational system to do that.
Yeah, I think in Mexico, and yes, just like many other countries, we are facing lots of challenges. We have gone through 4 different reforms, and no changes at all. I think we have a long way to go. And let me share something with you. My daughter is 14 years old, and she just started high school. And the other day, she was really complaining about the school. Well, she's complaining about the school all the time. But the other day she asked, like, Mother, why do I have to learn about this, this, and this, and this, and this, if it's not going to help me to do anything in life? Why don't they just teach me how to write a ZB, for example? Why don't they teach me how to do taxes, for example? And I was like, okay, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to her at the moment, but she's been like that. She had a chance to do 3 years in the UK,
Right.
second year, year 3 and 4, and she said those 3 years were the happiest in my life.
Right.
Yeah, because it was, even though of course there are some issues back there in the UK, it was a total different education system. She really enjoyed being taught in a different way.
It has to be said, though, that we also have endless rounds of education reform. And sometimes, I mean, one of the problems is everyone thinks they're an expert on education because they've been through it. Everyone's been to school, therefore they are an expert on education because they've got personal experience of it. A lot of politicians, particularly the Conservative Party, come out with a sort of romantic, backward-looking account of what education should be like. Whereas other parts of the world, they're taking a much more prospective view, thinking about what is it we need to do to prepare for flexibility in the future, which is inevitably is going to be the case. And that I think is, I mean, it's not like that in medicine because we haven't all been doctors, but you don't very often find somebody going into a hospital and saying, you know, you said you're going to do an operation, I don't know, somewhere here. Well, I don't think you should make the incision there. I think you should make the incision here because that's what I prefer. You won't get that, or you know, because you have a different grasp on the notion of expertise. And if teachers are pedagogic experts, they ought to be treated with a bit more respect.
¿Alguien tiene otra pregunta? Ah, adelante.
Yeah, I just want to add that this pandemic times have worsened the situation with the opportunities for everyone to learn. And I think all the curriculums are not designed, the current curriculums are not designed to work in this be-learning or blended learning, they want to call it. That's been terrible, I think, at the moment, and more in a country like ours.
We've done some work on this. We were about to do a major survey of attitudes to exclusion and experiences of exclusion, and we realized identify new risks of exclusion. The first thing we found out was quite interesting, that there were some kids who loved it. They loved lockdown. They loved being at home. And these were kids often on the autistic spectrum, but not always. They were kids who'd been bullied at school, and the safety of being at home, they flourished. Or if they went to school, they'd work in a small group with one teacher in a secure way. So that of course, that situation is now changing as schools are opening up, and we worry about that. But then that's not many children in that situation. We have some kids who refuse to engage with online education. And to be honest, some of it was terrible. Some of it was just worksheets put onto a really bad platform and boring as anything to look at. And they stopped doing that. They didn't engage with any hard copy instructional stuff that came out. And they started just to go out. They didn't hang around in their homes. They went out. And they've been removed from anything that remotely resembles the routines and rituals of schooling to such an extent that we wonder whether they're ever going to get back in again. And this may be 15% of, our current attendance rate is running about 85% at the moment in schools. Normally it's about 96, 97%. So there's a concern there. And then there's major concerns, as I'm sure you've talked about in Mexico, with the general mental health profiles as a result of the pandemic. But generally things differentials have been widened as a result of what's going on. So for a family who live in a small flat, which is on the 3rd floor of a building with no balcony, with very limited internet access, where the parents may have lost their jobs because of the pandemic, so not enough food coming into the house, no possibility of buying clothes, often in situations where there's conflict with neighbors because they too are frustrated. The expression we've been using is pressure cooker homes, where pressure is building up. And some kids, the psychiatrists are saying, are sort of just going into a state where they're sort of just existing through this. And what the psychiatrists are worried about is it's building up, the pressure is building up and building up and building up. A bit like if you take a bottle of Coca-Cola with the cap on it and shake it and shake it and shake it. Then when things open up again, you release the lid, and there's real worry about self-harm. And there's evidence of vastly increased self-harm among some children. There's also the kids who maybe their parents have had the disease, maybe there's a lot of anxiety around, who've withdrawn into their bedrooms and won't come out. So there's kids who've just removed themselves from society completely. And there's lots of other examples, but that is really, Eric, if you write to me, I can send you a copy of the report that we wrote for that.
Please, please.
So Eric, if you drop me a note, reminding me, because my memory is hopeless.
In
I will send you a copy of the report on new risks of exclusion.
Yeah, in email?
Sorry?
In your email?
Yes, if you write to me an email, I'll send it back to you. It'll just remind me to do it.
Okay, yes. So anyone want to ask something more? The professor is able to to answer all your questions in this hour, I mean.
No, nothing else? Well, shall we close down then?
If you're ready.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's been very nice to speak with you all. I hope what I've had to say has been even remotely useful. And I will send that document over when Eric prods me to do it.
It would be very nice to have that one, please. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. It was very nice.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much,
Bye-bye.
Dr. Harry. Thank you.